Usually,
Okay, I think it's time we get started again. I believe I turned on the, yes, it's now being recorded. If you're trying to watch this on recording, I'm afraid I forgot to record the first half of the class. So you won't have that. You can make it up by looking at the slides, and you see the most of the material, but forgot to turn it on. Okay, let's pick up with this. This is the issue of smoking and lung cancer. Does smoking cause cancer? Now, you have data that people who smoke are more likely to get lung cancer, so you do have a correlation. The issue is, can you explain this with some third variable? What would it be? You might hypothesize that nervous people are more likely to smoke and nervous people are more likely to get cancer. So you could come up with some theory. There are some people that actually did experiments with monkeys, not with people. You can't really use an experiment where you have some assign people at random to a group and some of them smoke and some of them don't. But that's the only way you can try to control for some of these variables. And the fact that there are always other variables is a reason for denying a causal relationship, which the cigarette manufacturers did for a long time. This is not where I was ready to go quite yet. I wanted you to look at this graph. This is a 20-year time lag between smoking and cancer. This is when cigarettes were introduced. Seems like cigars and pipes don't cause so much lung cancer, but it's because people don't inhale it into the lungs. If you see the cigarette consumption, this is only for men, increased, and 20 years later, the lung cancer rate increased right in parallel with it. So that's fairly convincing that there's a causal relationship. It's not the same as if you had a controlled experiment, but that's the kind of data we have, and it's pretty good. By and large, people became convinced that smoking caused lung cancer, partly because we also had an idea of the mechanism, that there's the tar and the nicotine, things get in your lungs and so on. So we have a plausible explanation for why it does. Also because it gives us somebody to sue. So you can sue the cigarette manufacturers who would say, well, it was your risk, but they didn't warn you, and therefore they should have told you, and they didn't know. The state sued the cigarette manufacturers for the cost of treating people with cancer, which was good for the states. They got money from the cigarette companies, which is probably a good thing. But if you look at it economically, cigarettes actually save the taxpayer a lot of money because people die young. Like my uncle who smoked all his life, he was a pediatrician, he died at 63. He paid into Social Security all his life and never got a thing. You actually preserve life for us old folks, and we live to be 80 like me or whatever. It's not saving the government money. You really can't argue that it's an economic benefit. I think it's a benefit anyway because it's a benefit to still be alive, but it's not a money saver. But they managed to get the legislation passed anyway, which is probably a good thing. The other thing we try to do is to control for other variables with statistical controls. We can't sort things out into experimental group and control group. We can try to adjust the data for what the statistical controls show to eliminate the effect of extraneous variables. This is a lot of what I spent a whole semester teaching students to do when I taught sociological research methods. And I know how hard this is to get across sometimes, because I taught this to social workers for many years. So they were not inclined to it. But at least I can try to give you an example. This is what we call disaggregating the data. It's what we call a cross-tabulation. You break the group up. This is a study of age in marriage and likelihood of ever being divorced by income at age 16. Now, when you have something at the end, that's a variable you're trying to control. There's a theory that if you get married young, you're more likely to get divorced, which seems plausible. But how did they measure that? They said, did you get married before you were 20 or after you were 20? I'm not sure why 20. We have the convention in English that some of the numbers end with teen, so we talk about teenagers, which is not really a very good category. Other languages, they don't have that. There's a big difference between 13 and 19. A 19-year-old is an adult, but a 13-year-old is a child. They're still all, when we say teenagers, we don't usually mean 19-year-olds or 18-year-olds, I don't think. Maybe I'm a little sensitive to this because I got married 1 week before my 20th birthday for the first time. But I did get divorced. I was too young and immature, and I should have waited. But I got divorced after my second marriage too, which I had when I was close to 30. So what can I say? My first wife became a radical lesbian feminist and decided she wanted to be married to a woman. And I have a hard time adapting to that one. So I don't think it was because I was 19. She was also 19 at the time. We're still in a long fine. Anyway, what you do in this study is you break the sample down to the low income people, the medium income, and the above income. That is your family income when you were 16. The reason for that is people would say, well, people who get married young are generally poor people, and poor people are more likely to get divorced. So maybe it's really that you're poor that's causing you to get divorced. If you're not poor, you'll stay together. That may be true in the sense that middle and upper income people may have less divorce than lower income people. I'm not sure. You have to look at data to find that. So we introduce a control simply by breaking the group into subgroups. And that's something you should always do when you look at a finding that just involves two variables, is say, does it work for different subgroups if you break it down? And you can just ask that as a common sense thing. You may not be able to do the research, but you can look for it. So if you look at something like coronavirus, clearly it makes a difference what your age group is. If you're over 65, if you're over 80. So you want to control for that in order to see whether the vaccines are making an effect. Vaccines, maybe the people who have vaccines get more COVID, but it could be that that's because older people are getting vaccines. And they're still more vulnerable. School children almost never get it. So you have to look for controls of that. Another example that came up in Philadelphia, I don't have a slide for this. They published the death rate of the hospitals. How many patients die? What percentage of the patients die? And some hospitals have a high death rate, some have a low death rate. Which would you pick if you were going to go to a hospital? Would you pick the one with a high death rate or a low death rate? How many people would pick the high death rate hospital? Anybody? Nobody's going to say that? Well, you should. That's actually a mistake. The high death rate hospitals, what are the high death rate hospitals? They're the ones, the best hospitals in the world. They're the fanciest research hospitals. The hospitals, Walter Reed, the big name hospitals Who goes to those hospitals? People who are very, very sick and have a very difficult disease, and the local hospital's not able to treat them. Whereas who goes to the local hospitals? Maybe somebody's having a baby, maybe they broke their arm, you have to control for the amount of illness. If you had a random assignment and you randomly assign people to hospitals, then you would say that the lower death rate would be better. But the high death rate is a sign that they're dealing with people, many of whom are hopeless. And whatever they do, it's not going to work. They're going there to try some new experimental treatment that might work, which often happens. So you can't just look at two variables without controlling in some way for the other variables. And it's hard to get data to do that. You try to do that with statistical controls. Multiple regression is a statistical method that's used for controlling variables. And what we do is compute statistical equations that describe the relationship between a whole set of variables. This is a little complicated. If you've never had statistics before or whatever, don't worry about it, but I'm going to try to explain it. This is what we might call a scattergram. There's two variables here. This variable is height, and you can be 50, 60, 70, or 80 inches. That variable is weight, 100, 130, 140, 150, 160. And each dot here represents a person. So this is a person who's 60 inches tall and weighs 150 pounds. This is a person who's 50 inches tall and weighs 125 pounds. Now with regression, we fit a line to that. And a line has a formula. You have to take a certain type of math to look at the formula. The formula is right here. This is the dependent variable. It equals a constant plus another constant time. You multiply the independent variable by 2. I got this off the web, and there's a formula they give you that's clearly wrong. I don't know, that person went to all the trouble to put this together, and they've got a coefficient of 80. What this is saying is you multiply your height by 2, and add 80, you get your predicted weight. That's clearly wrong. I figure just by looking at it without doing any calculations that it should have been 10. So I weigh I'm 72 inches tall. How much should I weigh? Well, 2 times 72 is 144, right? If I add 80 to that, I would be 240 or something. If you look at 72, you can see that the result is right around 160. That's how I figured that the result would be 10. Now, which is the independent variable, which is the dependent variable? It's two variables here. Which is the cause and which is the effect? I don't really think there is a cause and an effect here. You're bigger, you weigh more, and you're taller, they go together. Certainly, if you do this over your lifetime, a small child grows, gets taller, and gets heavier. Maybe not in a linear fashion. But if we grow taller, we'll weigh more, or if we put on weight, we'll get taller. I don't think either one determines the other. So you could take either one as the independent or the dependent variable. You can't predict somebody's weight by knowing their height. Now, why do we do this? Only because we want to introduce other variables. Here's another example. This is a scattergram of a sample of people who tried to follow a diet, and the diet score shows how effective they were. People who got a 10 were the people who really followed the diet. people who got a 0 or the people who ignored it altogether. And here we look at their body mass index. The body mass index is something that takes into account your height and says, are you overweight? How overweight are you? Now, what would you say is the causal variable here? Which is the independent variable?
Body mass index.
Body mass index is the dependent variable, right? That's what you're trying to affect is your weight. The diet is trying to affect your weight, right? You go on a diet to lose weight, or maybe to gain weight if you're too thin. Most of us had to lose weight. I lost 25 pounds by going on a diet, so it can be done. You just have to make up your mind not to eat so much. I got a little app on the phone and put in all your calories. But the app, it's just when you make up your mind, you can control that. This data would show that it's worthless. If you look at this, there's no correlation here. They're all over the place. The people who stuck with the diet, some of them do well, some do badly. What do when we see something like that? We try to figure out what's going on. We don't believe that it doesn't work. I think if you really stick to your diet, you will lose weight. If you don't, you won't. So we try to look at it and see if there's something else that might explain it. Could it be that there are two different groups here? And both of them, there's a correlation. You see the correlation, but it goes from down to up. That means there's a correlation. That's a guess. And you say, well, what are the two groups? What could it be? Try to look at other variables. What other variables affect your body mass index? Well, one might be your sex, one might be your age. Pretty simple variables. And if you look at it, you see, here are the people who are under 20. Here are the people who are 20 or older. And within each group, you have the pattern for the males and the females. If you break it down that way, you can fit the lines to it pretty well. So it seems like there is a relationship between dieting and losing weight or not losing weight. But you have to look at people of different ages and different sexes separately. At least that's what this data seems to show. Now, the way to do that with multiple regression, you just do that with numbers. It's very hard to do it in a graph. It's easy to make a 2-variable graph. You get a 3-variable graph, it's going to be 3-dimensional, or else you can have different colors. Make the women pink and the boys blue or something. It's hard to perceive more than 2 variables on a graph. They've done a pretty good job here of labeling it and showing it that way. I'm not sure if this is real data, if they made this up. It looks too good to do. What you really have is numbers like this. You have their diet score. There where it says male, if somebody gets a 1, they're male. If they're 0, they're female, which is arbitrary. It could be the opposite. You could give the women 1 and the men 0. So you could say person A has a diet score of 4. They're female. They are over 20, and their body mass index is 27. So you have numbers like this, and you put them into a formula. It's a pretty simple formula. It's just one variable after another. There's a coefficient for each variable. There's an intercept, and you predict it. Now this is a technique that's useful if you want to make predictions. Some people try to use this to make causal arguments. You take these coefficients and standardize them so that you can compare them, and then you say which variable has the biggest causal effect. You can also make a number of equations. You don't have to have just one. I'm going to show you a video. Maybe this will make it more understandable.
Hello and welcome. In this video, I explain to you what a simple and multiple linear regression is and how you can easily calculate it online. And we get started right now. Hello and welcome.
This is just another website that shows the same thing. What gets another way of portraying this is what we call the path diagrams. And that is a way of graphing the regression equations. So in a path diagram, your dependent variable is over here. Your dependent variable is job satisfaction. So you can see a causal model. Your age is related to your job satisfaction negatively, minus 0.8. That means the older you get, the less you get satisfied, but not very much. Minus 0.8 is almost nothing. As you get older, you get jobs that give you more autonomy at work. And if you have more autonomy at work, you have a fairly good chance of being satisfied with your work. People who have control and autonomy at work seem to be satisfied. If you make good money, you're more satisfied. So when you say that age has little to do with job satisfaction, that is saying if you control for these other intermediate variables, so that age causes you to get a better job where you have autonomy at work, it causes you to get more income, and as such, you will be more satisfied with your job. If you don't accomplish these things, if you get older and you don't get more income and you don't get more job autonomy, you're probably not going to be happy with your work. So it sort of makes sense. Now, when you look at these coefficients and numbers, they give you a measure of how strong the relationship is. But they're not percentages, because in order to keep the plus and the minus, we don't square, you have to, we can't really square them, which would show the percentage of the variance explained. So you really have to square these to see how much it explains. So if you square 58 is almost 60, 60 squared is what? 36. This is like 35% of the variance can be explained. Down here, more like 25%. That's pretty good for social science research, but there's an awful lot that you're not explaining. I just thought I'd show you a few others of these. This is trying to explain self-reported general delinquency of 15-year-olds. And this number says we've explained, when you square it, R, capital R squared, we've explained half of the variation. So it looks pretty good, but how did they explain it? What are the causal variables? Well, if you have friends who are delinquents and you're a member of a gang, you're more likely to be delinquent. That's not surprising. If you were a delinquent at age 13, you're likely to still be one at age 15. So they're not very interesting causal variables. The main thing that's explaining it is if you were the 13 gang membership at age 15, this is how much of you can't explain of that. You can explain 8%, you can't explain 92%. At least it illustrates what your theory is with multiple variables. This is another one I found. I don't know, I've never heard of the concept of a hedonic balance. You have to put all these things together, your health, your mental health, your self-efficacy, your optimism, and your social support. They all go into your hedonic balance. Well, optimism is very little. Then you get to life satisfaction and you're happy. I don't really think this makes any sense. I just put it up because I thought it was odd. What's the difference between life satisfaction and happiness? And what these variables are. I don't know, this one's a little hard to read. This is trying to explain whether you're a homosexual as an adult, which is not politically correct just to do this at all. We're supposed to believe that it's innate, which I think is correct. But I can't see it quite as well on that screen. We've explained half the variation in this, 48.48. But how do we explain that? Childhood gender nonconformity. If you had homosexual arousal in childhood or in adolescence, you're more likely to be homosexual as an adult. That seems pretty common sense. It's not much of a finding. When you go back here, they're looking at a sort of Freudian theory. You have a strong mother and a cold father, more likely to get, you're less likely to identify with your father, you're going to have a negative relationship with your father, your mother's going to dominate your father, and maybe you're going to be more likely to turn out homosexual. However, the correlations, the coefficients are very low. And how do you know that they had a strong father, strong mother and a weak father? We're going by their recollection. It's interesting to see how you can plot these things out, but I don't think it has much to do with your adult homosexuality. The people who published this table didn't really think so either. In the book, they don't give it much importance. Now, there are a number of I had another one in here before this. Now, this is an article that is pretty well known. Statistical Models and Shoe Leather by David Friedman. He published this back in the 1970s in the Sociological Research Methods Journal. Regression models have been used in the social sciences at least since 1899, when Yule published a paper on the causes of pauperism. They're now used to make causal arguments in a wide variety of applications. And he's trying to evaluate the results. He concludes that they just don't work. That regression models are not really able to provide causal arguments. He argues that we ought to disaggregate the samples, break them up. He used the example of an epidemiologist named John Snow back in the 1890s. He was trying to figure out the causes of cholera. What causes cholera? Today we probably know the organism that causes it. He had one theory was that it was some sewage that gets in the water. So he went around London checking where the water supplies came from. And he looked at places that had clear water or places that were taking the water in from the same place in the same where they dumped the sewage. And he figured out what the death rate from cholera was, deaths per 10,000 homes. And he was able to show that clean water, purifying the water, cuts the cholera rate. Not by throwing it into an equation, but by disaggregating the sample. There's a number of books that have come out recently. How many of you heard of this book called The Bell Curve? This came out, I think, It's been a few years now. This was about intelligence and class structure. He was arguing that racial differences are correlated with intelligence. Basically, black people are less intelligent than white people. Asian people are a little more. That was the argument. It's very incorrect politically. When you put the bell curve on the corner, this is trying to argue that this is scientific because the measure of intelligence gives you a normal curve, a nice bell-shaped curve. What is the bell curve? Bell curve is actually a distribution of random errors. When you have random error, you get a bell curve. But it's also the distribution of some human traits like height of men or of women if you separate them, which seems to be because they're caused by a large number of genes that randomly mix together. I happen to have written an article called The Myth of the Normal Curve, which we published in a rather obscure journal put on the internet. It came out at the same time as this book, and I got a tremendous number of hits and citations, people reading it. The normal curve is sort of taken as an indicator of quality measurement when it's really a measurement of error. The other thing that Herrnstein and Charles Murray did is use multiple regression, the statistical technique I was just talking about, to control for other variables. People say, well, black people don't score as well on IQ tests. That's because they don't get as good an education, because they come from poorer families. You have other variables. They tried to use other variables to explain that. The problem with it is that the methods they use are the same methods that many social scientists use. So they claim they were doing the same as everybody else. We tend to believe them when we like the results. We don't like the results, we tend not to believe them. This is out of sequence here. Let's see if I can
And it has nothing to do with.
Oh, I had a picture of this book. What's the slide here? More Guns, Less Crime. This is another book that used multiple regression. He did a whole study to prove that places that have more guns would have less crime. I published a paper called Myths of Murder and Multiple Regression, which you can read. I don't have time to go over it now. I see we're running out of time, and I didn't get to Ben's thing yet. Let me just show you a clip here of him on the.
And that has nothing to do with liberty. My concept.
I've got several here.
Now, Ray Suarez takes a closer look at the potential powers and limitations on what the president and individual states can do.
And for that, we get two views from people who've written extensively on gun-related issues. Adam Winkler is a professor of constitutional law at UCLA School of Law and author of Gunfight, The Battle Over the Right to Bear Arms in America.
This is the best one. Just to show you the kind of arguments that we get. Now I'm going to save this for next time. We're going to talk about arguments. Let me just, these are good clips, but we will look at them next time. Next time we're going to deal with arguments and not with any numbers. I want to go on and show you. Sure, I have them study here. Those aren't here. Just to end up, we talk about quality assurance in scientific research. How do we know that research is valid? First of all, it goes into a publication, and if you send something to a scientific journal, they send it to other scientists to review. That's what's called peer review. Then it has to be replicated. The scientific study should be redoable. It should just be a unique chance thing. This led to a crisis in psychology, in particular, called the replication crisis. When we started to find that many things cannot be replicated. This was ticked off by the study that we saw in the video at the beginning, the one of Ben's study on time and precognition. His idea is that you could anticipate the future, which would be a nice trick if you could do it. Fortunately, it doesn't work. If you go to a casino, if you could predict what number was going to come up on a roulette wheel, it would be very profitable, except that casinos would stop doing it. This is the actual study and how it looks like. It's called Feeling the Future, Experimental Evidence for Anomalous Retroactive Influence on Cognition and Effect, which sounds very abstract and difficult terminology. The term psi denotes anomalous processes of information or energy transfer that are currently unexplained in terms of known physical or biological mechanisms. Two varieties of psi are precognition, conscious cognitive awareness, and premonition, effective apprehension of a future event that could otherwise not be anticipated. You know that something's going to happen. Precognition are special cases of more general phenomenon, the anomalous retroactive influence of some future event on an individual's responses. So he set up the experiment, and you saw the whole video that explained that experiment. Like you were going to guess which of three boxes had a prize in it, and you would pick, and then the computer would assign it at random after you picked, and you were anticipating in advance when it would happen. And he reported that this worked. He published this in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, which is one of the top journals in psychology. Many people argued that they shouldn't have published it because it was too ridiculous. We know that time doesn't work that way. Time is linear. Maybe it isn't. Maybe on very short distances, time is circular or something. You can argue that from some places in quantum theory on a very atomic level. You can argue that time is at least instantaneous. It doesn't travel. You can, one atom can affect another over huge distances instantaneously. So he argues that maybe it could work. The result of this was that there was a big controversy, and a lot of people started to replicate his experiment. And he encouraged that. He made his software available. He said he wanted people to replicate it. And with a period of time, most of the people who replicated couldn't get it to work. And then people started to look at his statistics in more detail. They found that he was a little bit sloppy. People run a lot of experiments, and if one doesn't come out right, they say, well, there was something wrong there, I won't count that one. But the problem is that he was not really less rigorous than a lot of other people. And the result is that people are beginning to be more demanding, particularly of replication. And one of the problems with scientific journals is that if you just replicate somebody else's study, they're not terribly eager to publish it. Journals want to publish something that's new and exciting and that hasn't been published before. So there's a disincentive for scientists to just repeat things. Now, in the chemistry lab or the physics lab, it's not so hard to repeat something. You know, high school students can replicate many of these findings in physics, but to replicate an experiment like this is a good deal of trouble. And then once you do it, you may not get it published or it doesn't advance your career. There's a tendency to file away failed studies. It's what's called the file drawer effect. So it's raised a lot of skepticism about scientific research, particularly in psychology, which is there's attempts to improve in that regard, but there's problems with that. This is what's called a replication crisis that emerged in the 2010s. I got a recent study. This is the Royal Society for Open Science, and they're trying to set up standards so that we will replicate things more rigorously. They conclude that the evidence of ectocentric deception in general and their study was probably, original experiment was likely affected by methodological flaws, or else it was a chance finding. So nobody is really taking that seriously, except I guess the person who put out that video and people who are looking to promulgate certain things. I didn't really get to some of the exciting arguments there about gun control. Next time, there won't be any statistics or any numbers, so don't be scared away. Next time, we're going to deal with arguments. And everybody has arguments, right? So you all have experience with that. We'll look at the flaws and how people do arguments. And particularly, I'm going to look at the abortion issue. And I'm going to look at it. I found an argument called the Apple argument against abortion, which is very popular. It's an article that's been published over and over in some Catholic journals. It's so popular that you can buy a term paper from 3 different companies to hand in to your teacher to say how much you like it. I try to come up with the flaws in it and critique it. I had a conversation with the author, Peter Kraft, not talking, but email. I emailed him. He wouldn't email me back. He wanted to mail me his response printed out on paper. I'm not sure why, because obviously I could scan it. I could scan it and share it with you if you like. But so next time we're going to look particularly at, I picked abortion because it seems to be an issue that people argue about and nobody ever convinces anybody. And opinions are very rigid and they don't seem to depend on research or data or facts. Of course, there's a question of what's a fact? Is a fetus a person? You get into definitions of words. And of course, that depends on how you define person. The way person has been defined in Oxford English Dictionary in the English language over the last few centuries is somebody who has intelligence and understanding and so on. But you could define person differently. Anyway, that's what we're going to do next time. So I'm afraid if I've scared you with numbers and statistics and all of this, don't feel that that's what's going to be next time. Next time it'll be arguments, and we can argue about abortion. I assume we have a division of opinion on that, so people should be able to take sides. If you have some other argument that's been published somewhere or something you'd like me to look at, you would like to talk about, email me about it. Don't find too many times when people are trying to publish a rigorous argument using the laws of logic. Peter Kraft, the guy I'm critiquing, he's a philosopher at Boston University. He claims he's doing a real philosophical analysis. So that's what we'll do for next time. I think that's enough for today. I know it seemed like I crammed a lot of stuff into 1 hour, but I hope you absorbed a certain amount of it.